We're going to get started in a few minutes. Thank you for joining today. Just waiting for a few more people to join and we're going to get started. Thank you. So, Carrie, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay, sounds good, Kathy. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Carrie Shannard-Koonders. I'm the Executive Director of the South Dakota Board of Pharmacy, and I currently chair NASCA's Education Committee. I'll be hosting this afternoon's webinar along with NASCA's Kathy Keogh. Hopefully you've been reading the scrolling material while you were waiting for the webinar to start, which provides information on our sponsors, our disclaimer, housekeeping items and announcements. Today's webinar and all of our webinars throughout the year would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. So thank you, sponsors, and thank you for making time out of your day to join us for today's webinar. Green Products in Gray Markets: Understanding the Pharmacology and Use Patterns of Kratom in the United States. We are thrilled to have two highly qualified experts to explain this to us, because as Kathy and I were mentioning before the call started with our speakers, that we don't know very much about Kratom. So Drs. Kirsten Smith and Dr. Christopher McCurdy will be presenting today. Please allow me to introduce them. Dr. Kirsten Smith has been clinically and scientifically involved in understanding kratom use since 2016. Presently, Dr. Smith is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, working as a research faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Smith also has a master's in clinical social work and is licensed in the state of Maryland. At Johns Hopkins, Dr. Smith continues to investigate kratom use methods developed at the National Institute on Drug Abuse intramural research program, where she trained for 4 years prior to joining Johns Hopkins. Dr. Smith is NIDA supported to continue kratom research during using both laboratory and field-based methods. Dr. Christopher McCurdy serves as an Associate Dean for Faculty Development and a professor in the Department of Medicinal Chemistry, with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Pharmaceutics and the Frank A. Duckworth Eminent Scholar Chair in Drug Research and Development. He is also director of the University of Florida's Translational Drug Development Corps. Dr. McCurdy completed his training as a pharmacist at Ohio Northern University and moved on to complete his Ph.D. in medicinal chemistry from the University of Georgia. He completed a 3-year postdoc fellowship in the Department of Medicinal Chemistry at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy with distinguished Professor Philip S. Portuguese. McCurdy began his academic career in 2001 at the University of Mississippi, where he rose to the rank of full professor with tenure and served as an interim department chair. He moved to the University of Florida in January of 2017. Dr. McCurdy is a broadly trained pharmaceutical scientist and pharmacist whose research focuses on the design, synthesis, development of drugs to treat pain, anxiety, substance abuse for over 25 years. Much of his research has focused on opioid, neuropeptide, FF, and sigma receptor ligand probe design, synthesis, pharmacological evaluation, and development. He is an internationally recognized expert on Kratom, which is under investigation for opioid withdrawal syndrome, opioid use disorder, and treating pain. A significant portion of his career has been dedicated to the development of novel sigma receptor ligands in collaboration with interdisciplinary groups to generate and optimize selective ligands that could serve as critical experimental tools. More recently, has worked to develop these as potential medication development leads to attenuate the effects of cocaine, methamphetamine, and to treat substance use disorders. Since arriving at the University of Florida, he has received $21 million in federal grant funding. Most notably, Dr. McCurdy has developed a PET-MR imaging diagnostic agent for visualizing the origins of chronic neuropathic pain by interacting with sigma receptors at the site of the nerve damage. The phase 1 and 2 human clinical trials are currently being conducted at Stanford University. He's published more than 190 manuscripts and holds 8 patents. He is currently funded by multiple NIH grants and the Florida Department of Health. In addition, Dr. McCurdy serves as a consultant to the US FDA, Safety and Risk Management Advisory Committee, and previously served as president of the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists. Whoa, these two are super talented and extremely smart, it sounds like. So welcome, Dr. Smith and Dr. McCurdy. Please go ahead. We're excited to have you here talking about Kratom.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak to everyone and hopefully bring a little education to something that is quite confusing out there in the marketplace for sure. I'm actually going to give a little bit of background on the history of what Kratom or Kratom is, talk a little bit how it was used historically and how it led to an interest in individuals in the United States. And then I'll touch a little bit on some of the chemistry and pharmacology of the alkaloids, but very little bit. I don't want to overdo my welcome with chemistry. So let me just go ahead and share my screen and get going. And then Kirsten will start to take over with more of the use patterns and whatnot. So I'll try and be very brief as I go through this. But Kratom or Kratom, as I mentioned, is really botanically known as a Mitragana speciosa. This is, and many of you heard that it's in the coffee family. The plant family is called Rubiaceae family, and that is the actual where the coffee plant also falls. However, Mitragana speciosa or Kratom does not contain caffeine. If there is caffeine, it's been added or people consume with caffeine-contained beverages. You can see that it is defined by its leaf, and the leaf is up on the top of the screen there. The leaf is actually shaped like a bishop's hat. If you sort of turn it negative 90-degree counterclockwise. And a bishop is also referred to as a mitre, and that's where the name Mitragynna came from. Just the leaf shape, which is really indicative of this species and genus. There's a flower that flowers, and the flower is key actual identification tools for the specific species. There's about 10 different species in the Mitragynna family, and some of these are being sold in the US under different product names as well. And that's kind of a whole other issue about how confusing the Kratom marketplace is. It did originate in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand and Malaysia. And on the map there where I have a little red circle, this is thought to be the epicenter of the origin of the plant of Malaysia and Thailand. Since then, it has spread throughout Southeast Asia, and the majority of product that's coming into the United States we know is farmed in Indonesia, where at last I heard there's well over 220,000 individual farms in Indonesia that are producing product that is exported. It was illegal in Thailand and Malaysia. The main reason it was outlawed in Thailand and Malaysia was that it cut into the opium trade, which was taxable. And I can talk about that more if you have a question later. But more recently, both Thailand and Malaysia have legalized Kratom again, and the main driver was economics. They're losing all the money because Indonesia is driving that forward. It is referred to as Kratom in Thailand and Kitom in Malaysia, or Biak Biak. Kratom is a complete American pronunciation of the plant name. So if you went over to Southeast Asia and said Kratom, very few people would understand what you're trying to talk about. We do know that the chemistry is highly evolved, about 40 different alkaloids that are present in the plant. We'll focus a little bit here on the traditional use. The traditional use of Kratom is really as a tea or chewed leaf. So in Malaysia, they brew a tea, and that's what I'm showing you here. These are pictures that I took on a trip to Malaysia, showing a tree in its flowering stage at the bottom left. Leaves are picked fresh off the tree in the morning. They're cut up or ripped up and put into a pot of boiling water for about 3 hours. After that tea beverage is made, they call it juice. They will dispense that in baggies, or I'll show you in a plastic water bottle. Although it was outlawed at the time that I was there, this was a roadside stand where they were actually selling materials out in public, and police would drive by. There was really no enforcement of those laws. It has been used traditionally by field workers, mainly in that rural area of that border between Malaysia and Thailand, to their work capacity in the hot, humid environment outdoors, really as a stimulant. And it has this sort of paradoxical stimulant and opioid-like effects, which can actually be used in that area to reduce opioid withdrawal, or really opium withdrawal. These people will use raw opium, and when they run out of opium, they will use Kratom to sort of carry them over through that until they can get more opium. Recently, with some of our colleagues in Malaysia, we've shown that polydrug users, those that use opium and methamphetamine, are actually using Kratom to the use of methamphetamine. And so this was an interesting find because we have no FDA-approved treatments for methamphetamine or cocaine. And so there was some interest sparked from the drug development side of our world to start looking at these for stimulant use disorders. The predominant active ingredient that we hear about is mitragynine or mitragynine. It is a indole-based alkaloid that you can see here chemically. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after I go through and show you just some of the actual ways that this is made. As I mentioned, the leaves are picked, they're washed and cleaned, then they're ripped and boiled in water. And then, as I showed, they were sort of served up in a drink sort of fashion. The gentleman over there in his mug actually has some Kratom tea where he's added some milk to it. It is a very bitter drink. They also add a lot of orange to it as well, or have fruits stand by to counteract the bitterness. But they consume these, they enjoy them. They do it as a normal every morning drink, every afternoon drink. It's very culturally accepted amongst the male population, sort of like we all enjoy coffee or tea here. Just some more pictures of these gentlemen sitting around from different walks of life. But mitragynine itself, or kratom itself, have had very few deaths attributed to it alone. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, there haven't been any reports of deaths over centuries with traditional kratom use. Mitragynine, that major alkaloid we know, is a partial mu opioid agonist, and so it only acts the receptor to a certain level that is far below that of a standard full agonist. We use Damgo, but you can think of something like morphine or fentanyl in this place. It's also what we call a biased agonist that has no beta arrestin recruitment. So this is a protein in the cell that arrests cell signaling. And what's thought to be, if this is not recruited, is that you have much less side effects associated with the use of these products. So low respiratory depressive consequences and low constipation effects compared to traditional opioids. And this is bared out in some publications by colleagues of ours, but it's also been known for quite some time that this does not have the respiratory depressive effects or constipative effects of traditional opioids. And we started to see that bear out within scientific literature as well. And so what got us interested and what drove funding for us from the National Institute on Drug Abuse was really opioid detoxification and being able to use this to replace several medications that are used for detoxification, interact with mechanisms in the body, not just opioid mechanisms, but I'll show you that the alkaloids interact with several targets, making it a very complex and complicated pharmacological mix. And what we thought is that this single product could help improve medication adherence and complete detoxification. We could also look at this in similar fashion to buprenorphine or methadone, where it could be used as a medication-assisted therapy. And in fact, the withdrawal that's been measured from kratom in acute situations, and I have to underscore acute, we have not done human studies in chronic users. We have not done even chronic animal studies to look at what the withdrawal would be, although we have anecdotal reports from humans, several human users that have pretty severe opioid withdrawal after ramping up their use to tremendous amounts of material, as well as using it for several years, where they have difficulty getting off, and there's actually individuals seeking treatment for getting off Tom. So there's definitely an abuse potential there, and we have to figure out where those kind of lines and safety issues are as we move forward. The problem in the United States has been a lack of a standardized product that really prevents us from doing rigorous clinical trials. One of our grants that we have with the National Institute on Drug Abuse is really purifying mitragynine within the plant to do clinical trials for opioid use disorder. But we also are involved with the FDA right now in a safety study looking at where safe doses are and where adverse events start to show up with just kratom leaf material itself. And so there are some trials underway. Hopefully have some answers in the literature sometime in the early part of next year. Part of our efforts at the University of Florida have start cultivating kratom, and we've done this in greenhouse, but we've also done this in the field. Florida is one of the unique places that this tree, which is tropical and needs tropical or subtropical environment to grow. Florida is a uniquely positioned place to be able to grow these trees. So what we're dealing with in the United States, and Kirsten will talk about this a lot more, the products are different. They're shipped over from Southeast Asia. The leaves are dried in Southeast Asia. They undergo a lot of transport issues in terms of cargo ships environment differences with heat and humidity, and this is why some of the products have had bacterial or fungal contaminations, just because of those storage and transport conditions. And what we've been trying to do is really understand what's happening with a more traditional approach and taking the fresh leaf, which is totally different than what's in the US marketplace. And Kirsten will talk about that. I promised some chemistry. I'll show you a little chemistry. What you can see here is that this is like the old Sesame Street or kids matching book that, where are the differences? If you look at this quickly, most of these compounds look very similar. And in fact, they are. Many of them are structurally just isomers, basically left-handed or right-handed or mirror versions of each other. Mitragynine, the major alkaloid, case in point, is just a isomer of speciogynine, another major alkaloid, speciosialatin, which is another major alkaloid that we find in the plant. And then there are other compounds, all of which we've figured out the of and understand what's going on. And I call this a complex symphony orchestra. You've got so many different compounds doing so many different pharmacological activities that there's a lot to tease out here and understand what's happening. And one might think that opioid is the predominant player in this, but it actually is not the predominant player in the activities of Kratom. And this is something that we're really trying to understand at a basic science level, a toxicity level, because providing animals, at least that we've overdosed with Narcan, is not the answer. They die. We do have some ideas as to what other systems are involved, and I'll touch on that directly here in a moment. We do know that 7-alpha hydroxy mitragynine or 7-OH mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine is a metabolite. This one has garnered a lot of attention because it is a mu opioid agonist as well. And so I'm not going to go into too much details on the pharmacologies and the chemistries, but what I want to do show you is that we've screened these against all the CNS drug targets. So all drug targets that have a marketed drug that interact with them are available for us for screening through a company called Eurofins. And we can look at this at a couple of one, we high concentration for screening capabilities, and we can see that mitragynine interacts with many receptor targets, all at this high concentration. So we have 5-HT or serotonin receptors, we have alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, D is for dopaminergic receptors, and then K and mu, these are kappa and mu opioid receptors. We also have some interaction with potassium and sodium channels. But when we drop that down to a dosage that would be more pharmaceutically relevant at a nanomolar, we don't see interaction with any particular target stand out. So we wanted to really interrogate that and understand what was going on, and we measured actual affinity values. So this is like golf. The lower the number, the more, the better the compound is for interacting with that particular. And what you can see here on the top line is the mu opioid receptor. And so this has 136 nanomolar affinity. If you put that in context with something like morphine has about a 30 nanomolar affinity. If you go into fentanyls, you're starting to look at 0.0 some nanomolar affinities. So affinity doesn't equate to potency, but it certainly has a play in that role in terms of how much the compound interacts with a target. We do know that it's a partial agonist at these mu opioid receptors. We also measured an alpha adrenergic receptor partial agonist, and we know that it's a agonist at alpha-2 adrenergic receptors, although this table is a little outdated from a few years ago. That activity at alpha-2A is because that's where the drugs lofexidine and clonidine that are used for treatment of opioid syndrome are employed. And so in a single molecule, we actually have a buprenorphine type mu opioid receptor agonist, partial agonist, and an alpha adrenergic type agonist similar to lofexidine. So two drugs that are employed in treatment of opioid withdrawal and opioid use disorder actually could be handled through one molecule. That's why we had an interest in that. If you look at poison control center data, and we've dove into a lot of the center data, and Kirsten will touch on this as well, but kratom overdoses resemble stimulant overdoses and not opioid overdoses. I won't belabor that any further. I will say that 7-hydroxymitragynine, the other compound that's received a lot of attention, is a full agonist at mu opioid receptors, and you can see has quite a higher affinity. So 6.2 versus 136 nanomolar affinity. Has significant agonist effects. Not only does it have those effects, it also has an abuse liability that we've measured in animals. This is a very habit-forming molecule, either on its own or if we substitute this molecule purely for morphine or heroin, it's used directly for either one of those. Again, that molecule is not really available by itself. So I'm talking about these two molecules isolated. But mitragynine itself is kind of a disruptive pharmacology that has these different pharmacology activities, not just opioid, but has non-opioid activity. I didn't go into all the details and I won't go through all of this, but we know it has less tolerance, less abuse, and less ability than other opioids at equal analgesic doses. And it doesn't appear to have abuse or addiction potential on itself, and actually reduces morphine and heroin intake in rats. The 7-hydroxy compound, though, is something that is very more dangerous, and we feel is something that needs to be watched. And this is why we've pushed hard on the American Kratom Association and some of the states that have looked at adopting some Kratom Consumer Protection Acts or regulations around this to limit the amount of 7-hydroxy mitragynine available in products, as we feel this is one of the pieces that is dangerous. We do know that mitragynine is converted by the intestine and the liver to 7-hydroxymitragynine. So this is a metabolite in the body, but the amount of metabolite that is produced doesn't seem to be significant in terms of pharmacology or addiction, at least in an acute setting. And again, we haven't been able to measure chronic settings. Just to touch quickly on some of the other major compounds that are in there, we have another compound called speciosialatin. Again, exact same chemical makeup, just a different handed version of mitragynine or mitragynine. Interacts with mu and kappa opioid receptors, does have opioid effect. We move into another molecule, corinanthidine, that has high affinity at alpha adrenergic receptors. So these are involved in the cardiovascular system. And this is something that could be playing to some of the more toxic effects when we get to the higher concentrations. It does have pretty high affinity for alpha adrenergic receptors and lower affinity, but still decent affinity for opioid receptors. Painanthine, and I'm going to skip to the next slide, which is called speciogynin. Both of these compounds are almost identical. The only difference is a double bond in this sort of arm chain that's hanging out. These are high affinity serotonin and they could also create some of the problems that we see in overdose situations, creating almost like a serotonin syndrome in patients in an overdose situation. Again, we haven't been able to measure these in great detail, but we do feel that alpha adrenergic and serotonergic mechanisms are taking over in most of the overdose situations. And so I'll wrap up just by saying there's been a long, safe history of use in traditional manner in Southeast Asia. The alkaloids or the compounds are very different from opiates. They do have these strange pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic problems or properties, which I term disruptive pharmacology, and we still have a lot of gaps in the science around this plant. But on the flip side and positive end of it, we do think that there's a possible solution to the opioid epidemic from nature as well, or at least part of it. And so lots of people to thank. I'm going to skip all of that in the interest of time, but the work takes an army, and it's definitely not me that gets to do any of it. I just get to talk about it. So thanks for your attention. And Kirsten, with that, I'll flip it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And let me get this pulled up. Good day, everybody out there. So I am going to take you on a whirlwind, all right? This is a lot of information, so just brace with me because Chris and I can talk each respectively for like 10 hours about this. So in the United States, we know people have been using Kratom since at least 2007, likely before that, but really we started to see an uptick in 2007 and then another real big uptick around 2014. We have horrible prevalence estimates. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health puts it like 1.8 million people who are using, but I mean, I think Chris and I would both agree that's kind of an underestimate. And we do have sources based on import data and sales data that indicate it's somewhere between 5 and 15 million. As far as how many people are regularly or daily using, I would say it's several million people based on the sales information. But again, we just have very poor estimates at this point. So Chris took you down the beautiful botanical path. This is where we're at in the United States. When we talk about Kratom, I think it's very, very important to define what we're talking about. So to say, you know, I learned about Kratom today, or I'm using Kratom or whatever, what do you mean by that? Because we're not in Southeast Asia where we're picking fresh leaves and making a tea out of it. We have this landscape of products that are very diverse, increasingly diverse. And so I think one of the big takeaways is that when we talk about Kratom, we really have to understand what it is we're talking about. And that'll become clear as I go. So is it legal? I wish I had known that this was more of something that people wanted to know about, because I'm not going to get into this too much, but if anyone has questions, you can contact us. So it's not at the federal level, it's not scheduled by DEA. The Food and Drug Administration does consider it to be an unapproved and unregulated new dietary ingredient. So our title of our talk is very apropos. It is the greatest of markets that Kratom is being sold in without oversight. And ironically, we were talking about this before the webinar began, some of the regulations that are being put into place via the Kratom Consumer Protection Act are being put forth by industry and advocacy groups because you know, they want to be able to sell their products, so they don't want to get shut down necessarily. And so there's a lot to unpack with this, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but I will say it is banned in 4 states. Rhode Island has actually passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So it's de facto legal in the vast majority of states. You know, and there is federal legislation that has been introduced, but I don't think that will go anywhere. Who is using and why? So we know that overall, based on a lot of our surveys, and again, I'm sticking with the US only, we have people in their early 20s to mid 70s, big age range, a slight majority male in our samples. Most have at least a high school degree. Most are non-Hispanic white, and this is America. So if you're using one thing, you're using more than one thing. And so by default, all Kratom users in the United States, I would say, are polydrug users, just given how much stuff people are using. And we've seen that in survey after survey. Most are using less than 20 grams per day when we're talking about the whole plant material. So extract use is increasing, and I'll touch on that again later. But because of the cost and for other reasons, most people who use regularly are using some whole plant material. Now, it's not fresh right off the tree, but you know, so it's dried and it's older, but it is a whole leaf material. Extract use, you know, it is a different story, and we'll talk about why those differences matter. Case reports, which I'll touch on again later as well, they give us a glimpse into higher doses. You know, most people who use regularly are using, again, less than 20 or 30 grams per day. But when we do see some adverse events, typically it's associated with these higher doses. I am going to show you some unpublished data. It's either under review or we're working to analyze it. And this was done at the National Institute on Drug Abuse when I was there prior to coming to Hopkins. And I want to show this because it really gives you a day in the life of the average American Kratom consumer. And it is the most up-to-date data I can give you. So, you know, it is not published yet, though, not all of it. And so we had a detailed survey. We had 15 days of ecological momentary assessment, which is just a fancy way of saying that we had people entering data at random and scheduled intervals into a study smartphone app for 15 days so we could get proximal information rather than retrospective reports. And then we had people send in a sample of their Kratom products. So we had 357 people complete this just a few months ago, and most were using whole leaf material on a daily basis or near daily basis. Again, very diverse population, both and very reflective of prior samples in terms of education, income. Again, race, ethnicity is mostly non-Hispanic whites, but other than that, pretty diverse group. This is just a few pictures of what the app looked like so that you have a sense of what I'm talking about. And then we had people enter information at different times of day. We would have their waking and sleep hours. So everything was customized based around their schedules. I'm not going to get into the methods of that. And then we ended up collecting 330 product samples, which Chris's group at Florida has analyzed. And he can talk more about those, but we did see a lot of consistency across samples as far as the alkaloids. So over the 15-day period, we had over 13,000 unique kratom use events that were collected. That's a lot of events. And with those, we were able to do a cluster analysis. And a really simple way to think about it is just the frequency of dosing. So this group A here was dosing the most often, most frequently. Cluster E dosing least frequently. And I should note, this is not the amount per dose, just the frequency of dosing. Regardless of group, though, you can tell that everybody is using more in the first half of their waking hours. So this is not like a late night thing, even though we know some people use recreationally. This is a daytime or whatever your daytime waking hours are. It's happening more in the morning and the afternoon pretty consistently. I'm just showing you this because it underscores how difficult this is to measure given the variability of products. So this is just different types and the different units that people report. So when we have case reports, and we want to try to standardize something to like a gram or whatever, it's very difficult to do. Like it's extremely important to understand not only what product is someone taking, but how, what the correct unit of measurement is. So this is a nightmare to kind of work with. But we looked at, again, all of our dosing data, and across these groups that I was talking about, we see that, people report on a survey, they actually tend to overestimate their use compared to what they were reporting during the ecological momentary assessment phase. And I should say we had really good rates of compliance, over 90%. So we have pretty good data validity. And then variability of use. It's a pretty regimented substance in terms of how people are using it. Interestingly, the people who use it or who are dosing less frequently, so this group D and E here, they actually have a lot more variability. And in a way that makes sense. So this group A here that's dosing most frequently, they're a lot more regimented with their use and consistent. So broad motivations. Why are people taking kratom? We asked this on the baseline survey, very much in keeping with other surveys. We found people are saying managing psychiatric symptoms and drug withdrawal, quality of life, increasing energy, decreasing pain, recreation, perceived safety relative to other substances, and then as a long-term drug substitute. These are, again, broad motivations. They're not mutually exclusive. And typically people have like 2 or 3 core reasons why they use, and then a few other secondary reasons. This one motivation for use I want to highlight because it kind of goes back to some of what Chris was talking about, but also because we didn't see a lot of differences in our groups in terms of the broad motivations for using, but this is one that stood out, which is our dosing cluster A. So those that were dosing most frequently were more likely than the other groups to be using kratom as a long-term opioid substitute. And interestingly, this group is also more likely than the other groups to report perceiving kratom as both life-saving, but also to report perceiving it as habit-forming. So again, going back to this abuse liability and risk versus benefit, at least from even the consumers themselves, they're stating 2 things that aren't necessarily contradictory, but it is a complicated situation to unpack. As far as proximal motivations of use, so these are in real time as people are taking their kratom, what is driving that use? We see that pain relief is a huge one, followed by improving mood, increasing energy, productivity, focus, alertness. So again, those analgesic and stimulatory effects, the combination Chris was discussing, we've seen this discussed by people time and again, and there is something to that. Followed by feeling good, which I should say is separable than wanting to feel high, which we also assessed for, but it did not make the top 10. We do see people using here Some people to prevent kratom withdrawal, a little bit higher in group A there. So obviously some indicators of dependence, which I'll touch on again in a minute. Acute effects, very consonant with those motivations, right? So how do they feel? Energized, focused, alert, sociable, talkative. A few not reporting that they're feeling any effects. That could be, again, another indicator of some sort of tolerance, but also it could be we're just getting people at the tail end of our follow-up window. And then some warmness, flushed, locomotor activity. But again, very stimulatory-like effects. So again, it's making sense of that more daytime use patterns. So what are people taking with kratom? We actually were surprised at like how pedestrian some of this was. This is not to say that people have not taken other drugs or don't occasionally. We have their entire drug use history, but we don't have a lot of illicit drug use here. Cannabis is the only one that actually stands out. And again, it's legal in many states now. Caffeine, nicotine were big ones. And then these analgesics right here are actually acetaminophen, ibuprofen. These are not opioid analgesics. And so again, this is concerning because of course co-ingestants are always concerning, but we didn't see the illicit drug use that we thought we might see. People who use regularly, probably unsurprisingly, they do perceive it as largely compatible with their daily roles and obligations. And again, not just in this sample, but others, you know, when we ask them at the end of the day, how do you feel your kratom effects interacted with your roles and responsibilities? And you know, most people are overwhelmingly saying it was compatible or helpful. With respect to sleep, we don't see a lot of, it's actually kind of all over the place, but the trend here was that most people were saying it doesn't affect their sleep one way or another, but if it does, it tends to increase the quality or quantity. But again, a lot of people aren't using for the purposes of sleep, even though that does come up with respect to pain management. This is perhaps the most important slide I'll show and what I'm best qualified to talk about, which is substance use disorder for kratom when assessed with DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. So we've assessed this in 3 other samples, 2 of which are published, 1 is under review along with this. And we see that across all of our groups, no matter how frequently people were taking it, on average, symptoms were less than 4. So just so that you know, you need to have 2 to 3 symptoms to have a mild diagnosis. And we do see some severe, for a few outliers here, we do see some severe substance use disorder for kratom, but again, mostly mild to moderate. And in our prior samples, again, mostly mild. When we look at the individual symptoms, this is really being driven by tolerance and withdrawal, which is how physical dependence is defined. We do see some use of, some uncontrolled use, particularly with group A. But again, we have tolerance and withdrawal, craving, and then we get into what we're not seeing and what we didn't see in our other samples, which are impairments in psychosocial functioning, acutely hazardous or risky use despite social problems. So again, from a clinician standpoint, you know, we are seeing dependence. I don't think that is in dispute among people who use regularly, even if it's whole plant matter. We do see some tolerance and withdrawal symptoms, but people are not going out and robbing a bank to buy kratom, at least not yet. When we look at signals of withdrawal, so this is assessed on our survey, so it's retrospective, but we ask people, you know, how do you feel when you miss 1 dose or 1 serving of kratom? You know, we see craving, lethargy, difficulty sleeping, fatigue, irritability, muscle aches. When we go to 1 day of cessation or more, we're seeing these more pronounced, but also some anxiety, yawning, restlessness, and I should say restless legs come up a lot anecdotally. When we're talking about kratom withdrawal, and we at Hopkins are actually, we're doing a large study, but part of the study involves a supervised withdrawal component in our inpatient facility. So we are going to be getting some pretty detailed assessments of kratom withdrawal in the near future. I want to touch on case reports because, you know, it's frustrating. Like we did at NIDA these 2 systematic reviews, this one on morbidities that were just general physical health morbidities, and then one very specific to kratom addiction or dependence, abuse, anything in that ballpark, because the terminology was all over the place. And these were global, so not just the United States. And we only had, you know, very few cases to review. And I think it was 55 individuals for the addiction one. And, you know, I attend the American Society of Addiction Medicine conference every year. I talk to clinicians. I know that there are more than this, like this is not it, right? But we are not seeing a large clinical footprint in the medical literature, in the case report literature. And so when someone asks me, is Kratom addictive or what's the safety? I mean, it's very hard to answer this question. I think the one thing we can say is that tolerance and withdrawal symptoms are fairly well documented. But beyond that, we have very poor assessment methods, and a lot of our takeaway with these reviews, and also we're doing one on forensic toxicology, and it's a kind of a nightmare because there's very little information provided. So we're operating, not only with a lack of clinical trials, but also just a lack of reporting by clinicians. We did do a small pilot study, which we've expanded and are turning into something larger at Hopkins, but at NIDA, we had 10 of our large national sample. We had 10 of those participants come in and self-administer their Kratom product at NIDA. And we did a battery of assessments that are way too long to get into on this talk, but I just want to note a few things. So pupil diameter did decrease pre or following self-administration of the Kratom product that people were taking. And these people they'd been using at least a year. One had been using up to, I think, 13 years. So indication of mu-opioid receptor activity there. We did not see any respiratory depression at all. All of the vitals were within healthy, normal parameters. And I'll just say that with respect to intoxication, neither subjective intoxication nor observed intoxication was evident, but psychomotor performance was unchanged. Driving performance was also unchanged. I'll touch on that in a second. I should note that this is all whole plant matter that was consumed, ranging from 1.1 to nearly 11 grams. And again, these were experienced users. These are a few of dozens and dozens and dozens of driving outcomes. I showed this slide because people like the driving simulator. They tend to want to ask, is it impairing? And so we did not see any impairing effects from Kratom. But again, these were not Kratom naive individuals. We know that this machine and these simulations can detect with pretty good sensitivity impairing effects, because we see this with alcohol, we see it with cannabis. We did not see it with Kratom. Again, if it was a Kratom naive person, we might have seen impairing effects. We did see some within group differences, but again, some people actually improved on some tasks, and some people had a slight, decline on some tasks, but very subtle. And then again, there was no trend for any one task. And again, I think if we had given these folks Kratom extracts, maybe we would have had a different result. But again, among people using regularly, not a lot of impairment. I did do interviews, and I think one of the main takeaways from that was that people don't think they can overdose on whole leaf plant material. And they did warn about, they do worry about liver damage long-term or heavy metals. I mean, they were aware of some of the risks, right? But they just did not perceive that they could overdose. And again, that's a loaded word. We need to define it. And they don't think in terms of toxicity from the plant material. However, they cautioned about extracts, I should say. But they did describe this, and some of them called it the wobbles. Not everyone, but several people did. And this is something that they experienced when they had an unintentionally high dose. So all of our participants went through their own kind of dose finding experiments in order to figure out, what is the Kratom serving that works best for me. And doing this, they would inadvertently take too much Kratom at some point. And when this happened, they described this very unpleasant feeling that was, it passed within hours. They didn't seek medical care, but what they described was much more similar to serotonergic excess or even adrenergic activity. We know penanthine and speciogynin are high affinity 5-HT1A receptor ligands. And so it could be that there's serotonergic and alpha adrenergic activity that is driving this adverse or toxic kind of response. But they did not describe anything that resembled an classical opioid overdose or opioid toxicity. Again, that's not to say that that could not happen. But again, it was a very unique set of things and very consistent across participants. And really, I think there's maybe one case report that's talked about serotonergic excess with respect to Kratom use. And I think it's because doctors are not looking for it. If you Google Kratom, you see opioid, you don't see all the other stuff that Chris talked about. And presently, I mean, there are just very few cases related to toxicity or fatalities. But again, this could be due to the samples not being tested for mitragynine or many of the other alkaloids. And of course, even when we do have those tested, co-ingestance makes interpretation of findings very challenging. So we're again operating with just a lot of unknowns. Hopefully the clinical trials that we're getting underway at Hopkins and elsewhere will give us a better understanding. But in the meantime, I think one of the takeaways that I'd like to leave you with is just, again, when we talk about Kratom, we really need to be specific, and we need to understand differences between whole leaf materials and then extracts and then concentrated extracts, because there are differences, and it might be the case where we do start to see different types of overdose like or toxicity like symptoms based on different product types. And so again, many people that contribute to this, so I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to take questions.
Super, thank you. This has been fantastic. Lots of info. Kathy, do you have any questions in the chat?
I actually do, and I'm sorry for my dog barking in the background, such is life. Kratom is very similar to cannabis as far as source, uses, and lack of studies. My understanding is that they go through similar enzymic pathways, including CYP3A4 and CYPC9. Oh goodness, they know more than I do, which is taken together and can cause a buildup for both substances. What is the harm of using both together, both acutely and over a longer period of time? Have there been studies using both regarding outcomes?
Yeah, so I'll jump on this one because this has been something that's been of high interest to us in the research area. Several individuals have reported using CBD products in combination with Kratom products, and that's not too much of a
Chris, you're frozen.
you
Chris, you seem to be frozen a little bit, unfortunately.
I'm gonna oh, sorry, bad times. You can hear me?
Yes.
Now we
Okay.
can.
I'll try to be quick. They're sold together. Individuals claim that it actually helps treat their chronic pain better. They can use less of Kratom when they combine it with CBD type products. So marijuana, cannabis, a little bit different, but we've conducted some studies to look at the combination together in rats. We do see enhancements in chronic pain efficacy. So lower doses of both CBD and Kratom can be used to achieve efficacy. We haven't published that yet either. But we also know that because of these enzymatic pathways in metabolism, both working through these same pathways, we do see that CBD combined with Kratom increases Kratom alkaloid exposures. So we do see higher exposure. There could be a couple reasons for that. One could be metabolic. The other could be that CBD itself is acting as a vehicle, maybe along with the MCT oils or the things that are formulated with CBD that will actually push compounds, and not just Kratom alkaloids, but other compounds that are co-ingested with CBD products into the lymphatic system. And that lymphatic system delivery acts more like an IV delivery of a drug than a simple oral delivery. And so there's a lot of complexities there that we just don't understand yet. We're trying to figure out and understand, but CBD has been touted as increasing the potency or efficacy of many things. And definitely Kratom is one of those, and we have seen effects on alkaloids in animal studies that we've done. again, we'll try and do more studies, and then as we are able to start combining things with Kratom in humans, I think that'll be definitely on the list as well. I don't know, Kirsten, if you had anything to add.
Nope, you nailed it.
Okay, all right, the questions are coming. If people want to stick around for a couple of the answers, cute dog, by the way. How is Kratom regulated in the legal blue states?
I'll start this and Chris can add to it. So so those blue states that I showed are where the Kratom Consumer Protection Act has been passed. And it's not the exact same act in each state. But the short answer to your question is that it's not really regulated yet. So I think, I mean, the legislation, even though it's been passed, still needs to be implemented. But I think one of the commonalities is age restrictions, and then good manufacturing practices, certain levels of mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine. So it's a little bit different each state, but in some states it would be the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health. So it's a very state specific piece of legislation, even though the name is more or less the same. And I should say that, it's very early days for all of this legislation. And so to say that it's regulated, I think, I would say loosely regulated at best. I could talk for 2 hours on this. So Chris, maybe you want to add something about what you think about the KCPA and regulations.
I think it's a start. We published an op-ed, myself and another one of my colleagues here at Florida, Oliver Grunman. We published an op-ed piece in the Tampa Bay Times on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and really pushing the state to adopt it because it is a first step and it is something that starts to put some regulations in place. There's a big difference of having something on the law books and having someone or some group to enforce it. And as of now, I'm not sure that there's anybody that's capable of enforcing anything in any of the states that have passed any type of legislation. So this is a big question, and which group would enforce is, I think, the question. Right now, it's all left up to individuals to self-report. But then the question is, where do they even self-report the violations to? So there's just a lot of, I think, a lot more questions than there are answers with the legislation. There has been a bill introduced in Congress at the federal level to implement some federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act as well. And that's going to be discussed in Congress in the upcoming months. But I don't know too much more about that right now.
So would it be possible for one of you to send, I don't know if it's something that's a model act for people or something that you could send that we could distribute to our members, the model act?
I would just note that there's, again, it's going to be a little different by each state. And honestly, I promise you, I'm not affiliated or working with the American Kratom Association, but they are behind this, right? So they're the ones really pushing for this. So I actually would encourage anyone who's interested in this aspect to go to the American Kratom Association website, poke around there, because you're going to absorb a lot of information and get a vibe for all of that. But then also you're going to see that map that I showed. And so it's if you just navigate around, you'll see that map. And then I would recommend for interested people to go to the states that have passed that and look at, or that have had it introduced, like Ohio, I believe it was introduced, but it's not been passed. And you should be able to see it online and read the bill online. But there's not just one bill. So
right.
that
I'm looking and I see that, so that's helpful. Thank you. So the next question is Any reports of poisoning in children? Our state poison control center, this is from the state of Maine, our state poison control reports cannabis and opioid poisoning in children as two of the most common events for calls and hospitalizations.
I'll briefly note that I'm unaware of that. We do have some neonatal withdrawal syndrome that, and I know Chris can talk to that a little bit better. What I reviewed the neonatal abstinence syndrome, but I've not heard of any exposures among children to date.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on if you're just defining under 18, then I know that in some of the states that I've been called where local bans have been put in place, it's because high school kids have gotten a hold of extracts and have had some adverse events, but not any, as far as I know, not ending up in emergency rooms or anything like that. But this was part of the drive to ban Kratom products in a lot of the cities and counties that have been banned, because kids could walk into a gas station and buy these without any type of restrictions. So I don't know of any specifics there. And just real quickly, just to follow up on the cannabis, we have not done any studies with THC. I saw there was an extra question to follow up about THC. We have not done any studies specifically with THC or cannabis directly with Kratom in animals, and I have not heard much about it with human usage. It's been much more with the CBD side of things. I don't know, Kirsten, if you can comment on cannabis, specifically THC cannabis.
So sorry to say this, we have data where speaking to like patterns of co-use in terms of like what substances complement each other best with Kratom. We have not looked at those data yet. We do know that people are using cannabis with Kratom even more so than they are CBD products, at least in our samples. But we don't, as far as any like mechanism or any really detailed anecdotes, we don't have a lot to go on. We just know there is a decent amount of co-use. And even I would say more so than like alcohol or anything like that, but not a lot of information.
Okay, and one last question before we wrap it up. This was very interesting because I know I've certainly didn't know much about this at all. The Kratom store in my neighborhood offers stimulant Kratom red and sedative type Kratom green. Can these two effects be separated, or is it just simply marketing?
So I'll take a quick stab at this. Not really a stab, I'll just give you the science. So there's 4 different colors of leaf material that are imported into the United States. Those colors are based on how soon or how late those products are ground into powders. So the greener material is a fresher leaf material that's been recently dried. And then they will allow leaves to go into what we call senescence, or basically die off, but still have their cells intact. And so the compounds are still there and whatnot. But what we've done is we've actually tested and analyzed for content of all the alkaloids in all of those different color types, and they're consistent. So there's no real difference. And in speaking specifically to vendors and wholesalers, it is a complete marketing gimmick with all the different products that are out there and available. But I don't think you could nail them down to say that publicly. So that's there. They do have some batches that they'll get in where the alkaloid contents vary tremendously from previous batches that they've had, and they'll sell those as something, different or stronger or more specific to some effect. But there's no real evidence to demonstrate that increased alkaloid content would provide either a stimulant or a sedative effect, and it's mostly based on what we know dose related. And so when people take small amounts, they get a much more enhanced focus, attention, stimulant type like effect, almost like an ADHD type effect, or ADHD drug type effect, than they do with anything else at the lower doses. As they increase the doses, they start to get into more sedative type feeling. And as they increase from there, it can get into agitated states. And then this is where we start seeing it look more like stimulant overdose, where there could be cardiovascular issues that start to arise. But most of it's agitation and irritation with the patient or the person.
Okay, well, we're a few minutes over time. Carrie, are you still with us?
I think we lost her.
Yeah, I know she had another meeting to go to, but I just wanted to thank you both. This was very informative. We had great turnout, great questions. I know I learned a lot. And hopefully, I've actually been taking some notes, so now you know who we are. And thank you so much for today's presentation. And on behalf of the National Association of State-Controlled Substances Authorities, thank you everyone on the call for joining us. And if you have questions or you need to reach either of our esteemed panelists, just shoot me an email and I will get that information to you. Thank you again.
Thank you all.